Good. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for this exciting and important conversation. My name is Amanda Runyon, and I'm the Associate Dean and Director of the Biddle Law Library at the Penn Law School. On behalf of the Penn Biomedical Library, the Toll Public Interest Center, Biddle, and the Penn Law of Office and Equity and Inclusion, it's my absolute pleasure and true honor to welcome you all to this session of the Grab a Book and Take a Break series. We are so lucky to have Professor Dorothy Roberts with us today to speak about her work in the fields of law and public health through the lens of her paradigm-shifting book, Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. Professor Roberts, an acclaimed scholar of race, gender, and law, joined the University of Pennsylvania as its 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor, with joint appointments in the Departments of Africana Studies, Sociology, and the Law School. Professor Roberts is the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology, the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossel Alexander Professor of Civil Rights, and the founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society in the Center for Africana Studies. As a leader in research on topics surrounding health equity, her career in law and public policy has focused on the intersections of health, social justice, and bioethics while unraveling the injustices perpetuated against women, children, and African Americans by providers and businesses within the healthcare industry. Through critical interdisciplinary work, Professor Roberts exposes the racist and reductionist principles that underlie much of 21st century medical research and calls for ending the reliance on race as a proxy measure for projecting health outcomes. Through a critical lens, Professor Roberts examines the impact of policy on environmental conditions that consequentially lead to striking health disparities, such as inadequate housing, food deserts, and income inequality. Throughout her body of work, Professor Roberts highlights the disproportionate concentration of certain diseases and symptomatic severity amongst minority communities. A prolific author, Professor Roberts has written and published more than 100 scholarly articles and book chapters, and is the co-editor of 6 books on such topics as constitutional law and women in the law. Her prominent publications include her books, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, and the work at the center of today's discussion, Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. Professor Roberts' research urges us to critically evaluate the use of race, which is a socially defined concept, in scientific and medical research, and to break the cycle of validating race as a biological reality. Prior to joining Penn, Professor Roberts taught at Northwestern, Stanford, and Harvard. Here at Penn, we believe that law can be leveraged as a force for justice, equity, and good. The impact on both policy and society truly matters. We are convening today to put this belief into practice and to enter into a necessary dialogue about how to actively apply the values of social justice, human rights, and equity within our respective work. We will have the pleasure of listening to Professor Roberts speak for about 35 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. So without further ado, it is my distinct honor to introduce you to Professor Dorothy Roberts. Stop sharing the screen here, sorry.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Amanda. And thanks so much for this joint invitation to, or multiple invitations to speak at this great program to grab a book. And I'm really honored and excited about speaking about my book at Penn at the law school. I'm not sure if I have before, so it's good to have this chance. So I'm going to share my screen now, and let's see. Okay, how's that?
That's good.
Great. All right. So, and let's see if I can get, there's something. Oh, well. Okay. So I'm going to talk about, as Amanda said, and you all know my book, Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. It's a book that was published in 2011. And I became interested in writing the book when I began to read about the mapping of the human genome, and especially when the first map was unveiled at a White House ceremony in 2000, and President Clinton, along with the leading scientists, Craig Venter and Francis Collins all made a point of saying that the map showed that there was no such thing as race at the genetic level. President Clinton stated in genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99.9% the same. And he might have also added that the 0.1% or whatever the latest figure is that they've determined isn't divided into races. So this seemed like it was an important milestone, and maybe finally there would be an end to scientists' use of race as if it were a genetic category or a natural division of human beings. I had all my life thought that there was only one human race. That's what my parents taught me. That's what I learned as an anthropology major in college. And all my work previous to this involving medicine, my first book, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, the Meaning of Liberty, was at the intersection of racism and medicine. And I knew very well that there was definitive evidence against a genetic definition of race. So it seemed like finally had concluded the long multi-hundred era science that treated race as if it were a natural biological division. But I became quite disturbed when I began reading, primarily in the New York Times, articles by Nicholas Wade and others reporting on research that claimed that the next phase of the Human Genome Project was to look for genetic differences between races, to explain health inequities, for example, in genetic terms, and to finally establish the biomarkers for different races. And not only use them in terms of health inequities, but to look for genetic explanations for racial disparities in education and wealth. And I couldn't believe it. I remember I was teaching at Northwestern at the time, and I went to a lecture there given by the medical school, and they had Jonathan Enton, who wrote a book called Taboo, Why, I'm going to mess up the title. It's something like Why that Athletes Are All Black, so something of that nature. And he, at the medical school, this big auditorium, was talking about how important it was to identify racial distinctions at the genetic level and genetic reasons for racial disparities in health. And that day, I decided I have to look into this. What's going on? Let me explore whether there really is a resurgence in these ideas, and what are the implications, and why is this happening now at the turn of the 21st century? So I ended up then writing a book about it, because I found out that, in fact, there was this resurgence and interest in race-based genetic difference. And so my book makes three main points. One is just to document that researchers and reporters and others were just starting to define race again as a genetic grouping using high-tech algorithms and computer programming and big DNA databases to claim to be looking for racial distinctions at the genetic level. And then my main political argument was that they were using genetic explanations to explain racial inequities. Now, I wrote this during the Obama administration, and a lot of people were saying we were now in a race-less society, that racism was over since there was a Black president. And there was this problem of having to explain how there continue to be these gross inequities in health, in income, in education, in incarceration, in every aspect of American life, when racism was no more in America. And my argument was that, well, genetics is once again filling in for the causal explanation for racial inequities without looking at politics, being able to explain these inequalities as stemming from innate differences as opposed to political inequality. And I also wrote about the rise of biotech and pharmaceutical products that were based on this false idea of biological race, especially that could be found in our genes. So let me break down these ideas in the next 30 minutes or so. The first I want to point out, and this is how I started the book, was to explain race as an invention. And that's where the title of my book, Fatal Invention, comes from. I had learned in college that race was socially constructed, but as I did research for the book, I discovered that many people have in their heads that race is a biological natural division of human beings, but it's socially constructed, meaning, it's a biological fact, but it means something socially in different societies. And I decided to argue that race is not just socially constructed, it's completely invented. Race is not a natural division of human beings. There is only one human race. And those distinctions that we call races are purely made up. The very idea that human beings are naturally divided into races is itself an invented concept. And I explain how it was invented by Europeans, largely cemented into science through European typologists in the late 1600s, early 1700s. Although we can trace the idea of race in European science earlier than that. In fact, it's important to trace it to earlier than that because European Enlightenment scientists at the end of the 1600s took pre-modern theological folklore, the idea that God created human beings and divided them into races, that God created the first man as a white man in God's image, and all other people other than white people were inferior, were degradations of the pure white man that God created. So that idea, which today we would say is, creationist folklore, is exactly what science took up in order to justify exterminating other people, taking their land, and enslaving African people. And to be more specific, exterminating indigenous people in the New World, what they called the New World that they so-called discovered, and dispossessing them and enslaving African people, and also killing many of them, millions and millions of them. This was also related to Christianity because the Christian church, the Roman Catholic Church, believed that if someone who was captured converted to Christianity, they could not be enslaved. And so it was important to invent a justification for enslaving human beings, even if they converted to Christianity. And that justification was that originally that God created them as a different race of people who, less than human, who were not entitled to the privileges of white people, but then later taken up by Enlightenment scientists to give a so-called rational, uh, uh, proof that human beings were divided into races and that white people were superior and were entitled to rule everybody else. I think it's really important to emphasize that this is creationist folklore still today that has remarkably uh, resisted all sorts of scientific advances. And I would argue it's resisted it because it continues to be politically useful, just like it was in the 1600s, continues to be politically useful in the 21st century. Just to give another example of a racial scientist who believed in this creationist idea, but called it Enlightenment science, that this was discovered through observation, was Thomas Jefferson, who explained why Black people could not be included in Enlightenment political principles of tolerance and equality and freedom. Uh, and his explanation was nature created Black people differently, and that's why they could not be included. So once again, race becomes an invented idea that justifies political inequality by pretending that it is a natural division of human beings. It's an important aspect of this concept of biological difference between races was the use of this idea in medicine and the promotion of this idea by doctors. Doctors have always been very instrumental in promoting biological concepts of race because they're supposed to be experts in how the body works, and the idea that if races are distinct groups of people at the biological level, they would have different diseases is still to this day, for many people, a persuasive argument. Of course, first comes the idea that we need to divide people in order to subjugate them and create a society where some people are entitled to privileges and others are disadvantages. Then comes the invented idea that they are biologically distinct. And then comes the idea of the racial concept of disease, that people of different races have different diseases and experience common diseases differently. But that gets completely reversed so that when doctors say, oh, we've identified a racial disease, we've identified that Black people have one disease or experience a disease differently than white people or Asian people or Native people, it looks like proof of race when actually it's just an artifact of a false concept of race to begin with. But during the slavery era, this became a very popular way of justifying enslaving Black people. And Dr. Samuel Cartwright was probably the most prominent promoter of this idea. Dr. Cartwright trained at University of Pennsylvania Medical School, which trained many of the leading doctors of the South. There were more medical students from Virginia and other parts of the South at Penn at this time than there were from Pennsylvania or northern states. And Cartwright returned, actually got his medical degree eventually in the South, and was commissioned by the Louisiana Medical Society to create a report on his observations of the diseases and peculiar ways that Black people's bodies worked. And his main theory was, well, he said it was a fact that Black people had lower lung capacity than white people. In fact, so low that they had to be forced to work by white people to be healthy. And he also said that he diagnosed Black people who escaped plantations as having a mental disorder called drapetomania, that cause them to want to run away. Now, these two ideas that Black people have organs that function distinctly from other human beings, and that Black people who resist white supremacy have a mental disorder, those ideas have continued to modern day medicine. And I'll give some examples of that. So genetics has been really vexed by claims of racial difference at the genetic level. And geneticists have been debating this for ever since genetics became a field. And so we see that just a couple years ago, when the American Society of Geneticists met, they had to take up this problem that white supremacists were using some of this research allegedly showing racial differences at the genetic level in order to support their claims of racial purity and white supremacy. And so once again, the geneticists issued yet another statement saying that there is no genetic evidence of inferiority and superiority in the human species, and that, along racial lines, and that these white supremacists were misusing research by geneticists. So this became a way of distinguishing the race-based research that geneticists were continuing to do from white supremacists. But they still, what these geneticists fail to do is acknowledge that the research that white supremacists are citing is their research. They are continuing to produce research that claims to show racial differences at the genetic level, because that's what they continue to look for, despite all the evidence that race is an invented category. So, in fact, some research conducted after I wrote Fatal Invention confirmed this spike in the use of race as a genetic category in scientific journals, in articles on race and genomics. So the darker line here is a line showing the increase in articles that used race as a genetic category since 1990, well, actually since the mapping of the human genome. What's ironic about this is that there's a huge spike in those articles as opposed to those that treat race as a social construction right after the human genome was mapped. We also see, this is probably the most popular definition of race in genetic journals, that races are population clusters based on genetic differences due to evolutionary pressure. So this is just a reiteration of the idea that came out of creationist theology, and I should say from false creationist theology. There are also theologians that believe that God created all humankind equally as one group of human beings, but I'm referring to the idea that God created the races and created white people first and superior to others. That idea that God created the races, which was then taken up by European typologists who said, no, nature created the races. So they pretended to leave theological thinking behind, but actually just changed the source of this natural race creator. And this definition just adds a new scientific language to it, but it's the same basic idea. Evolution created the races. It's basically the same folklore that at some point in the distant past of human history, when nobody ever specifies, but at some point, some force of nature divided human beings into races. Now, this idea continues to be embedded in medicine. So one of the interesting aspects of it is that in modern day instruments and algorithms, diagnostic algorithms, you use race as if it were a biological category and as if races are categorically distinct from each other. And this leads to what's called race correction or racial adjustments, categorical adjustments in measurements of important body functions on the basis of race. The spirometer, which Samuel Cartwright used back in the 1800s and helped to refine in order to measure Black people's lungs differently from white people's lungs. Some spirometers today continue to allow the clinician to adjust for the race of the patient based on the assumption that Black people naturally have lower lung capacity. Another example, which I and others have been working on abolishing in medicine, and we've succeeded in a number of hospitals, and I expect an announcement soon at Penn that Penn will be getting rid of this as well. But it's routine in measurements of kidney function. So the eGFR, the estimate for glomerular filtration rate, is an important indicator of kidney function. And as you can see here, it automatically adjusts upward or to a healthier number for African-American patients. So according to this way of testing kidney function, again, which is routine around the country, Black patients automatically get a higher number than all other patients based solely on their race. And research out of Penn has shown recently that this has a significant negative effect for Black patients. For example, disqualifying some Black patients for getting on a kidney transplant waiting list because it bumps them above the threshold for having poor enough kidney function that you get on the waiting list. It also means that Black patients are systematically less likely to get specialty nephrology care because they are bumped up to a healthier number just because of their race. Another example of how these false ideas of race are embedded in medicine is the approval of the Food and Drug Administration of a race-specific medicine. Now, as I've suggested, race is taken into account in lots of diagnoses and prescriptions, in some automatically. But this is the first time the Food and Drug Administration approved a drug that was labeled specifically for a particular race. And in this case, it was African Americans, a drug called Biddle that is a therapy for heart failure. And the head of the advisory committee that heard testimony and reviewed all the data to explain why this really radical move would be taken to approve a race-specific drug, he said, we're using self-identified race as a surrogate for genetic markers without any evidence that Black people's hearts or blood vessels function differently because of genes, or that this drug would function differently in Black people's bodies because of genes. But it's just an assumption that Black people have some genetic difference that matter to the functioning of this drug. Another way in which race is embedded in medicine and why it's harmful to treat patients according to race is the well-documented fact that doctors undertreat Black patients for pain. There's many studies that show this, but one especially illuminating one was published in 2016 that found that a substantial number of medical students and residents at University of Virginia Medical School held false beliefs about biological differences between Blacks and whites, including beliefs like Black people have thicker skin than white people, Black people have less sensitive nerve endings than white people. And these beliefs predicted their mistreatment or under treatment of pain for Black patients. These are ideas that students probably come to medical school with, and medical school typically only reinforces stereotypes about biological differences between Black people and white people and other racial groups. Also in biomedical research, the idea that Black race is an identifiable biological category continues. And just one example, I just think this is a particularly egregious hypothesis, but it's pretty typical of many, many research studies that are funded by NIH and by private companies to test that Black race, independent of other factors, increases the risk of extreme preterm birth. What is Black race, and how in the world would you isolate it from all other factors that could affect the risk that Black women give birth prematurely? And yet, it not only was published, but it got a headline in the New York Times that very misleadingly said that the study points to genetics in disparities in preterm births. It not only could not prove that hypothesis, it didn't prove it, and yet it gets a headline that tells the public that the reason for disparities, racial disparities in preterm births is because of some genetic difference, some unknown genetic difference, because the researchers didn't even identify it. They weren't geneticists to begin with, so they didn't identify what it was. But again, these ideas that there's some unknown, mysterious genetic difference between Black people and other people that explains all sorts of inequities gets published in premier scientific journals. We're seeing how explanations of health inequities, competing explanations are circulating today with the revelation, not surprising, that Black Americans are far more likely to get COVID and to die from it. And despite all the obvious social reasons why that would happen, there were many articles published immediately that suggested that there was, again, this language, some unknown or unmeasured genetic or biological factor that caused this increase in the severity of the illness for African Americans. Fortunately, there has just in the past 10 years been a host of studies that have looked at how structural racism and the social determinants of health. Of course, the social determinants of health is an old idea, but there's been much more research funded looking at how structural racism in particular is a cause of health inequities. And I like the way that Kamara Jones stated it. It's racism, not race. That's a risk factor for dying of COVID-19. And we could apply this to all health inequities between people of different races in the United States. It's racism, not race. That's the risk factor. just a taste of some of the studies that have looked at structural racism in various ways. Many look at the neighborhood level and have associated residential segregation with health inequities because of residential segregation, where Black people in America tend to be concentrated in locations where there are high levels of poverty, high levels of toxins in the environment, high levels of violence, not only by community members, but importantly, by police who come into neighborhoods, harass, and sometimes kill and incarcerate, arrest, stop and frisk, all sorts of stress-inducing behavior in those neighborhoods by law enforcement, lack of access to high-quality health care, and a whole host of conditions that are concentrated because of structured residential segregation that was created by laws and policies and violence. This study looked at the disparities in heart attacks and found that Black people who live in states with high levels of structural racism, which they figured out a measure for, were more likely to report heart attacks. Other research has looked at and shown that police killings and police use of force have an effect not only on all Black Americans, but also on people who live in communities where police presence is prevalent. In Fatal Invention, I sum this up by saying that race is not a biological category that naturally produces health disparities because of genetic differences. It's a political category that has staggering biological consequences because of the impact of social inequality on people's health. And researchers have been calling this how racism gets embodied, or how racism gets under the skin. So I have been working closely in a very interdisciplinary way with biomedical researchers, geneticists, genomicists, public health scholars to bring this message into the medical field and the field of genomic research. Just some examples of work I've been doing. An article I published with Jonathan Metzl, who is a physician and a sociologist at Vanderbilt, where we took his idea of structural competency, teaching medical students how to be competent about structural inequalities, and my work on structural racism to provide some recommendations for doctors and medical students. Taking Race Out of Human Genetics was a very popular article in Science magazine that I co-authored with a public health scholar and two geneticists, including Sarah Tishkoff, who's a PIK professor in genetics here at Penn. The article in the New England Journal of Medicine, which just came out last month, I co-authored with a group of medical students here at Penn, who were the lead authors, also with Eve Higginbotham, who is the Vice Dean for Inclusion and Diversity at the medical school, and some other medical scholars, where we pointed out how race is misrepresented in the curriculum at medical schools and gave recommendations for changing that. And then another example is my TED Talk, which you can see has been viewed by more than 1 million people. The Problem with Race-Based Medicine, where I put all of this in a 15-minute chunk and in a way that's easy for medical students and doctors and the broader public to hear my message. So I'll close with how I concluded Fatal Invention, which is that instead of continuing down this path based on a false view of race as a natural division of human beings, a biological category, a grouping that's some mysterious force of nature created at some point in human history, and that it helps to explain racial inequities instead of looking at what actually caused them, which is structural inequality. Instead of doing that, we should be affirming our shared humanity by working to end the social inequities preserved by the political system of race. So I'll end there, and I'm happy to engage in a discussion about all of this and whatever else comes to your mind, Amanda. So
Thank you.
let's get out of this thing. Let's see. And stop share.
Yes, well, thank you for that. That is an incredible talk. We do have some questions from the audience, so
Sure.
I will start with this one, which is a two-part, but I'll break it into two questions separately
Okay.
here. How do we make sense of the use of mental illness and labels of deviance as a form of subordination with the need to provide mental health supports to communities of color who experience state-sponsored trauma at higher rates than white people?
Yes. So first of all, it's important to acknowledge that Black Americans experience, as I mentioned in my talk, traumatizing events because of anti-Black violence enforced by police. My current book project is on the child welfare system, and I've just been working just over the weekend on a chapter about the trauma caused by forcibly taking children away from their parents, caused to children and other family members. And that's another state institution. The trauma in schools that in Black neighborhoods are far more likely to have police officers. I could go on, and I think the question is based on all of this kind of state imposed trauma and other maybe less obvious ways in which structural racism causes stress in multiple ways. So it's important to acknowledge that, but the very acknowledging that recognizes that it's not because of some kind of innate predisposition that Black people have to be traumatized or to have mental disorders. In fact, as I pointed out, there's a long history of treating Black people's very rational reactions to racism as if it were a form of trauma, or a form of mental disorder, I should say. So in the 1960s, when uprisings were going on in protest to racist violence by police and others, the very diagnosis of schizophrenia changed, the official diagnosis, in order to label angry Black men as mentally ill. So it works both ways, but in whichever way it works, either mislabeling Black people's rational responses to racism as mental disorders, or ignoring Black people's trauma from experiencing structural racism, both of those require viewing race as a political category and the inequities that flow from it, not as because of innate biological differences. And I think that, keeping that in mind is essential to addressing the mental problems that exist in Black communities. Again, remembering it's nothing innate about Black people. The question also reminds me of an aspect of this issue of the relationship between race, racism, and trauma. And that is to be careful of arguments that trace Black people's traumatic, current traumatic experiences to slavery as if we have inherited some kind of innate biological problem that happened to us, to Black people during the slavery era. Instead of understanding how the inequities of slavery and the violences of slavery have been perpetuated in current structures and practices that cause trauma. And so there's this idea of innate Black peculiarity, Black biological difference. It just seeps into so many aspects of diagnosing various kinds of health inequities. And I think it's important to keep in mind, again, that it is racism, not race, that is the risk factor, regardless of which particular medical or health problem we might be talking about.
Great. The next question is, how does the popularity of the genetic testing kits like 23andMe
Yeah.
play into the compelling account that you give?
Yes. Well, first, it's important to understand that there are different kinds of genetic testing provided commercially. So some companies focus on giving you information about your likelihood or predisposition to various diseases based on the DNA sample you give them. But it's increasingly popular to tie race to these testing technologies. And so first of all, the testing companies that claim to be able to tell you what race you are, clearly are adopting this false view of race that I've been speaking against. Then there are some that tell you not what race you are, but what it sounds like they're telling you what tribe or ethnic group or it's usually tribe, right, that you descend from. And those have been quite popular with Black Americans. Many people have seen them used, for example, in Henry Louis Gates's TV show on PBS. And they are popular in part because many Black Americans are unable to trace their ancestry using archival resources because they weren't kept for enslaved people. He's found some amazing documents that have allowed people to do it, but very often he'll rely on genetic testing. Well, it's important to note that these companies, by and large, although I understand there's some new companies that may be coming out where they can actually tell you if you have actual relatives in a tribe in Africa, but these companies what they're doing is they're comparing your DNA to the DNA in whatever database they have. So they can only tell you if you share an ancestor with someone in their database, and they'll tell you the closest that they can get. So it's possible that they may tell you share ancestry with a current ethnic group or tribe in Africa. And it does not mean that you have relatives there. It really means that you're genetically, the most genetically similar to the group they happen to have in their database. Now, that raises questions, though, about the role of genetics in our identities. And I won't go on and on. I could go on and on, but I won't, because there are probably other questions. But I think we do have to ask, what role does genetic ancestry play in our identities that relate to any group. But as you know, as I don't know if the person who asked the question was particularly focused on ancestry testing companies that appeal to African Americans. But I think for Black people in America or around the world, there is an important question about how important is genetics to our identity, or is our identity based not so much on genetics, but on a common history, a common experience, a common mission to end racism and white supremacy.
That's great. How does environmental racism feedback on racism in healthcare and or genomic research?
Yes, well, that's a really great question. As I suggested when I was talking about current research on how structural racism affects health, and I mentioned that neighborhoods are an important mediator. They're because in the United States they're so segregated and there's such a high concentration of poverty and conditions that are not good for your health in Black neighborhoods. And one of those, as I mentioned, is exposure to environmental toxins. So research shows that Black people and also Native American people, Indigenous people, are at far higher risk of living in communities that are close by uh, locations that are bad for your health. I mean, whether we're talking about toxic waste dumps or highways or the resources in the community like water, you know, uh, Flint, Michigan is an example that are provided, you know, by the government that are bad for your health. And so environmental racism is one of the chief ways that health inequities are produced. And also, uh, one of the ways of countering the argument that the reason why Black people have poor health is because of some innate genetic difference, when there's such clear evidence that Black Americans are at higher risk of being exposed to environmental hazards. An example is asthma. There's research going on right now looking for, you know, a so-called African gene or, you know, reason why Black children are at higher risk of severe asthma, including asthma that kills them. And lots of research shows that Black children are more likely to live near asthma-inducing environmental factors like highways, for example. Just living near the exhausts of cars is one, and there's others as well. And we know this already, and yet money keeps getting poured into looking for some genetic explanation.
So this question is about the use of the EGFR uh,
Yeah,
metric in the testing. So there were issues with the original study, one of them being many fewer Black participants included in the study.
yeah.
However, can racism be considered as a social variable that can inform decision making? In other words, can the use and interpretation of race in algorithms be improved instead of abolished completely?
Yeah, I'm I'm very skeptical about that because first of all, it depends on what is the context in which race is being used. So I have a kind of simple rule of thumb, which is that race should never be used as a biological variable, you know, as if it is a biological category. But race may be helpful in understanding racism, measuring racism, ending racism. So if there is a way to do that, you know, overall, I think that the latter, I think we could explore it. But I have found that in so many collaborations, for example, between social scientists and genetic scientists or other biological scientists to try to figure out how to use race in a way that um, measures structural inequality, there's a tendency to fall back on the biological mechanisms. And then the intervention is on the bodies of the people who are disadvantaged by structural racism. So I don't want to rule out ever using race as a variable in research. I mean, no, not at all. As I said, if it's being used to measure and understand racism and end racism, that's good. But I still would caution that if this is being done in biomedical research or anything having to do with biology, especially genetics, you have to be very cautious that the research design and the interventions proposed focus on the structural racism and not on the biological mechanism that needs to be intervened on.
Okay, the next question is, what can we do to navigate conversations about racialized health disparities to counteract the ways that language around this tends to risk validating or even deepening health inequity, particularly as we see public discourse around COVID-19 and other current health concerns?
Yeah. Well, I think having discussions like this, I mean, this one is continuing to educate the public about how structural racism operates, and also educating people who are in the biomedical fields or practicing medicine. And that's the purpose of that article I mentioned that I worked with students at Penn Medical School and others to highlight how biological concepts of race are so prevalent in medical education and how to change that. It's in general, whether we're talking about medicine or biology more generally, or genomics more generally, or the STEM fields funnel students into a very narrow track where they are basically told that the hard sciences are what you need to study, and things like sociology and philosophy and anthropology are I don't want to say dissuaded in many places, but the students are dissuaded from taking them, but they don't necessarily see those kinds of courses as being important to their education. And so many arrive at medical school without ever thinking critically about what race and racism mean. And then they don't get any education about it in medical school. As I said, if anything, it just reinforces stereotypes they may have, and doesn't do anything to fill gaps in knowledge about this. So it's very important to understand that interdisciplinary knowledge is essential to good medical practice. I mentioned Jonathan Metzl and also Helena Hansen, another physician researcher. She has a degree in anthropology as well. They have developed this idea of structural competency, which focuses on the knowledge that doctors need to have in order to be competent doctors, right? That they need to understand the structural inequalities that have a much bigger impact on patients' health than the pure biological factors, especially if we're talking about health inequities. So it's not to say that genetics doesn't have any impact on people's health. But when we're talking about what produces these inequities that mean huge losses of life years, right? That those are produced by structural inequities. And we need a whole new kind of medical education that says that's important to know. And not only that, to know it, but how to apply it to medicine. This is brand new territory. Not to say that there aren't examples from the past. The Black Panthers had a health program that included prominently political education and political ideas and and objectives in how they provided free healthcare to Black communities. And so it's not as if we don't have right examples of this, but they're not prominent in dominant ideas of what medical education should include. So medical education or education of people in the biological sciences, understanding structural inequality is important, and then also getting this message out to the broader public to understand as well. The idea that race is a biological category and that biological differences explain inequality is still very popular in the in broader U.S. culture, and it's going to take a lot to teach a different paradigm. But I think if we see the importance at every level of education, and as I highlighted, medical students today they're really protesting the dominant traditional way of learning about medicine and making a huge difference. Medical students are at the forefront of getting rid of the EGFR, and they've succeeded working with faculty and clinicians and administrators at medical schools and hospitals, succeeded in abolishing it in, I don't know, but now it's probably 5 or 6 or 7 places around the country.
Well, thank you so much. It's 1 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and
Oh,
wrap
wow.
up here and apologize. We have several questions left in the queue that we won't get to, but I do hope we can continue this conversation one day. It was
Sure.
very enlightening, and I'd like to thank my colleague Hannah Rutledge, who's the director at the Biomedical Library, for suggesting this collaboration. And really, thank you for joining us. It has been an honor.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you for inviting me, and to everybody who attended as well.
Yes, thank you. We had over 150 attendees today. So.
Wow, that's great.
Yes.
That's great. Get the message out.